The letter was taped to my front door, big, bold letters screaming at me before I even had a chance to take it down. Notice of HOA fee increase due to unauthorized landscaping. I rolled my eyes before even finished reading. The HOA had been looking for reasons to squeeze more money out of me ever since I bought this house. I yanked the paper off the door and scanned the details. My monthly fees had been tripled, because I had planted a few bushes in my own front yard. I knew exactly who was behind this. Margaret Whitmore, president of the HOA, middle-aged tyrant, and self-proclaimed ruler of the neighborhood. She had made it her personal mission to make my life miserable since the day I moved in. I stormed inside, tossing the notice onto my kitchen counter before grabbing my phone. I was done playing nice. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from my real estate lawyer, Peter, in his office. He took one look at the notice and let out a low chuckle. "Unauthorized landscaping," he mused, shaking his head. "They're desperate." I folded my arms. They've been on my back for months. First, it was my mailbox being an inch too tall. Then, it was my driveway being too dark after I had it resealed. Now, it's my landscaping. Peter leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "You could fight them on this, but honestly, say let them dig their own grave." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He slid a folder across the desk. "The HOA doesn't know it yet, but the property the HOA office sits on, their little clubhouse, meeting space, and the land around it, it just changed ownership." I frowned, flipping open the folder. My stomach did a flip when I saw what he meant. My name was on the deed. I blinked. "Wait, what?" Peter grinned. "The old owner was fed up with the HOA, sold it quietly, and guess who bought it?" A slow smile spread across my face. The HOA had no idea that the very land they operated on now belonged to me. Margaret had just tripled my fees over some bushes. She had no idea what was coming. I sat in my car outside the HOA clubhouse, watching the afternoon sun glint off the windows. The building was modest, a single-story structure with a freshly painted exterior and a well-manicured lawn, one they had likely nitpicked dozens of homeowners over. The irony of it made my next move even more satisfying. Peter had given me all the necessary documents, each one stamped and verified. The deed was finalized, and the transition of ownership was legally binding. The HOA had been operating under the assumption that they still controlled this space, but that illusion was about to come crashing down. I stepped out of my car, locked the door behind me, and made my way toward the entrance. A few board members were already inside, their muffled voices carrying through the walls. I pushed open the door without hesitation and strode in, catching the attention of Margaret Whitmore, who sat at the head of the long oak conference table. Her eyes narrowed the second she saw me. "This is a private board meeting," she said, her voice clipped with irritation. I placed a thick folder onto the table in front of her. "Not anymore." Confusion flickered across her face as she reached for the documents. Several other board members leaned in to see what had just landed in their laps. I folded my arms and waited as Margaret's expression shifted from annoyance to shock. "This," she started, flipping through the pages. "This is a joke." "Not at all," I said evenly. "I own this property now, the clubhouse, the land, all of it. And as of today, the HOA is officially my tenant." A murmur spread through the room. A few board members exchanged nervous glances, while others remained frozen, still processing what they had just learned. Margaret, however, wasn't one to back down without a fight. "You can't just take over our operations," she snapped, pushing the folder away. "This is HOA property." I pointed to the title deed. "Not anymore. The previous owner sold it. You never had actual ownership. You were leasing it under an arrangement that expired last month. Nobody on this board bothered to renew it, so the sale went through without your knowledge." Her face turned red, whether from embarrassment or fury, I couldn't tell. Probably both. You think you can bully your way in here and cut her off? No, I think I can enforce my rights as the legal property owner, which means your board will now be paying rent to me. Oh, and about that fee increase you so graciously slapped on me, consider it void, effective immediately. Margaret shot up from her chair, her hands planted firmly on the table. This is outrageous. Actually, I said, pulling out another document, what's outrageous is that your HOA has been charging residents for violations without any legal basis. I've been going through the records. There are dozens of fines issued for things that aren't even in the official HOA bylaws. And since you operate out of my property now, I'll be implementing some new oversight. The room fell silent. Margaret clenched her jaw. You have no authority to dictate how we run this HOA. I smiled. You're right. I can't control how you run the HOA, but I can control what happens on my property. And if you don't like my terms, well, you're free to find a new location. A few board members looked visibly uneasy. Finding a new space would be an expensive and time-consuming nightmare for them. Margaret exhaled sharply, her nostrils flaring. This isn't over. I wouldn't expect it to be, I said, but be sure to let the residents know that any unauthorized fines they've paid in the last year, I'll be helping them file claims to get their money back. I'm sure the community will be interested in knowing where all those fees really went. Margaret's grip tightened on the edge of the table. Her carefully constructed empire was crumbling, and she knew it. I turned to leave, but before stepping outside, I glanced over my shoulder. Oh, and the first rent invoice, due next month. Have a great day. As I walked out, I could still hear the hushed, frantic voices of the board scrambling to figure out their next move. But it didn't matter. The tables had turned, and for the first time, Margaret and her power-hungry HOA were the ones feeling the squeeze. The HOA board was in a frenzy. Over the next few days, I saw members shuffling in and out of the clubhouse with hurried phone calls and frantic discussions. Margaret, who usually strutted around the neighborhood as if she owned it, now barely made eye contact with anyone. It was clear they were scrambling, trying to figure out how to undo what had already been set in stone. But there was no undoing it. I had already filed the legal notices, and the lease agreement was locked in. They had no choice but to pay rent to me or vacate. And given how much effort they had put into making this clubhouse their command center, I knew they weren't ready to give it up. That didn't mean they wouldn't try to retaliate. A few mornings later, I found a new violation notice taped to my door. This time, it claimed my front porch furniture wasn't in compliance with community standards. I laughed. They were grasping at straws. Instead of rushing to respond, I took my time. I grabbed my coffee, strolled outside, and casually removed the notice. I wasn't about to let them bait me into a reaction. Instead, I had something better planned. By that afternoon, I had compiled a detailed report. Over the past 2 years, Margaret and her board had issued fines for everything from mailbox styles to the color of outdoor chairs. Yet, a quick walk around the neighborhood showed that the board members themselves weren't following these same rules. Margaret's own house had patio furniture identical to mine. Another board member had an oversized mailbox that extended beyond the HOA's listed dimensions. And don't even get me started on the state of their driveways. I documented everything. Photographs, timestamps, and copies of past violation notices they had sent to other homeowners. Then, I drafted an official complaint and sent it to the HOA's own internal review committee. By their own regulations, they were required to process complaints within 2 weeks, and if they ignored it, well, I had a backup plan. A week passed, and the HOA board still hadn't addressed my complaint. That was fine, I wasn't expecting them to. What I was expecting was for the community to start asking questions. And they did. I made sure to share my findings with a few key neighbors, people who had been on the receiving end of Margaret's nitpicking and arbitrary fines. Word spread faster than I anticipated. Before long, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with discussions about the double standards. Residents who had been quietly frustrated for years finally had proof that the board wasn't following its own rules. Then, something happened that even I didn't expect. One of my neighbors, Greg, a retired contractor, knocked on my door one evening. He had a thick folder in his hands and a knowing look on his face. I invited him in, and he wasted no time laying out what he had found. Greg had gone through the HOA's financial records publicly available, but buried under layers of paperwork that most residents never bothered to check. What he found was damning. Margaret and the board had been funneling HOA funds into maintenance projects that never happened. Thousands of dollars allocated for landscaping, clubhouse repairs, and community improvements had simply vanished. And the worst part, the tripled fees I had been hit with weren't just about me. They had been trying to squeeze extra money out of every homeowner to cover up financial holes they couldn't explain. This was bigger than I thought. With Greg's findings and my own documentation, we had enough to take this beyond the HOA board. We needed to bring this to the homeowners directly. So we did. A few neighbors helped organize a community meeting. Not an HOA board meeting, an independent gathering of homeowners who were tired of the corruption. When the day of the meeting arrived, the turnout was overwhelming. Dozens of residents showed up, many of whom had complaints of their own. Some had been fined for minor infractions, others had been ignored when they requested repairs to shared spaces. Everyone had a story. Then we presented the evidence. Greg laid out the financial discrepancies. I walked everyone through the double standards and bogus fines. We passed around copies of the documents, showing in black and white how the HOA had been bleeding homeowners dry for years. The reaction was immediate. People were furious. Margaret, who had arrogantly dismissed complaints for years, was suddenly on the defensive. She tried to argue, claiming that the board had acted in the best interest of the community, but no one was buying it. Then the final blow came. One of the legal-savvy neighbors pointed out that under the HOA's own bylaws, if enough homeowners voted, the entire board could be removed. And that's exactly what we set out to do. A petition was passed around, and within an hour, we had the signatures we needed to call for a vote. Margaret and her board were cornered. They could see it. They had spent years ruling with fear, but now the community was united against them. The vote was scheduled for the following week. And if the results were anything like the turnout at the meeting, Margaret and her cronies were about to be out of a job. The night before the vote, the HOA board held an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. Normally, their sessions were closed-door affairs, but this time, dozens of homeowners showed up uninvited. People stood in the hallway, some peering in through the windows, waiting to see how Margaret and her allies would try to salvage their control. Inside, the tension was thick. Margaret sat rigid at the head of the table, her usual air of authority cracking under the weight of the community's anger. The other board members looked just as unsettled, flipping through documents and whispering amongst themselves. Greg and I stood near the back, letting the scene unfold. We had already done the hard work now. It was just a matter of watching them panic. Margaret finally raised her voice, trying to restore order. She spoke about how the board had always acted responsibly, how every decision they made had been for the betterment of the community. But the words rang hollow. People in the crowd muttered under their breath, some outright scoffing at her excuses. Then, someone from the crowd stepped forward. A homeowner named Linda, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades. She placed a thick binder onto the table in front of Margaret, flipping it open to reveal pages of financial records. Greg had shared his findings with her, and she had taken it a step further, highlighting every instance of suspicious spending, every discrepancy in the HOA's reported expenses. Margaret's face tightened as she scanned the pages, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. A man in the crowd spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He was a father of 3, frustrated after years of being told he couldn't install a simple playset in his own backyard. He pointed out how the HOA had spent thousands on administrative costs while ignoring real community concerns. Another neighbor chimed in, recalling how they had been fined for a minor paint touch-up, while one of the board members had an entire unapproved extension built on their house without consequence. The board wasn't just losing support, they were being exposed in real time. Margaret tried to regain control. She insisted that the board had always followed protocol, that the financials were above board, that any fines issued were justified. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Then, the moment that sealed their fate arrived. A homeowner near the front of the room, a quiet man who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand and stepped forward. He had been on the HOA board years ago, before Margaret's leadership took over. He pulled out a folder and laid it on the table. It was a record of the HOA's original bylaws documents Margaret had assumed no one would ever dig up. He pointed to a section that had been conveniently overlooked for years. The bylaws required a full financial disclosure to the homeowners every fiscal year. Margaret and the board had failed to do this for the last 3 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's expression darkened. She knew what this meant. This wasn't just negligence, it was a violation serious enough to justify immediate removal. The room erupted. Homeowners began demanding answers, some calling for her resignation on the spot. The rest of the board members shrank in their seats, realizing their leader had no way out of this. Margaret stood abruptly, knocking over a water bottle on the table. She tried to speak, but the noise in the room drowned her out. People were fed up. Greg leaned in toward me. "They're done." I nodded. Margaret had spent years ruling through intimidation, but now the entire neighborhood had turned against her. The meeting ended in chaos, with Margaret storming out and the board members scrambling to follow. But it didn't matter. The vote was still happening the next day, and now the outcome was inevitable. The morning of the vote, an unusually large number of homeowners showed up. Some came with their families, others with stacks of documents proving their grievances. The turnout was unlike anything the HOA had ever seen. Margaret and her board arrived late. They walked in together, their usual smug confidence replaced with unease. Ballots were distributed, and one by one, the homeowners cast their votes. Some people took their time, reading over the forms carefully, while others marked their choices without hesitation. It didn't take long to count the results. When the final tally was announced, a cheer erupted from the crowd. Margaret and her entire board had been voted out by an overwhelming majority. She stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. The control she had clung to for years was gone in an instant. One of the homeowners, a woman who had been fined repeatedly for trivial reasons, stepped forward and handed Margaret a small stack of papers. They were requests for reimbursement money that had been unfairly taken from residents over the years. Margaret's hands shook as she took the papers, but before she could say anything, another homeowner stepped up with their own set of documents. Then another, and another. A line formed in front of her, each person holding proof of the HOA's abuses. She had spent years making people's lives miserable. Now, she was the one drowning in paperwork. Greg clapped me on the back. "We did it." I exhaled, feeling the weight of months of frustration lift off my shoulders. Margaret had fought hard to control this neighborhood, but in the end, she had been undone by her own arrogance. As the crowd began to disperse, I caught sight of Margaret standing alone, staring at the pile of reimbursement requests in her hands. For the first time, she had no power, no authority. Just consequences. Margaret's downfall should have been the end of it. With the HOA board dissolved and an interim committee replacing them, most people assumed the power struggles were over. But corruption doesn't just disappear overnight. It lingers, hiding in the cracks, waiting for an opening. And Margaret wasn't the type to go quietly. In the weeks following the vote, things in the neighborhood started shifting. The interim committee, made up of homeowners who had been vocal against the old board, began reviewing past HOA actions. They uncovered immense financial mismanagement, missing funds, and bogus charges that had no paper trail. The deeper they looked, the worse it got. Greg had taken a leading role in sorting through the financials. He spent hours combing through records, trying to piece together where all the money had gone. What he found was damning. Funds that were supposedly spent on community projects had been funneled into private accounts. And the name attached to most of these transactions, Margaret Whitmore. But Margaret wasn't answering calls. She had gone quiet, avoiding all confrontation. The only time anyone saw her was when she rushed from her house to her car, keeping her head down as if hoping the whole thing would blow over. Of course, it wouldn't. One evening, Greg and I met with the interim committee at the clubhouse, my clubhouse now. The room had been rearranged, Margaret's old chair removed and replaced with a simple folding seat. The air was different, lighter. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore. One of the committee members, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana, laid out a thick binder on the table. She had spent years as an auditor before retiring and had taken it upon herself to go through every financial statement the HOA had ever published. Her findings were worse than we expected. Margaret hadn't just been mismanaging funds, she had been outright stealing. Over the past 5 years, she had used HOA money to pay for personal expenses, from extravagant vacations to home renovations. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars had been siphoned away under vague descriptions like community upkeep and administrative fees. Greg ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. This wasn't just a case of bad leadership, this was fraud, and it was time to do something about it. The next day, we filed a formal complaint with the local authorities. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank transfers, invoices that led nowhere, even proof that Margaret had used HOA funds to pay off personal credit card debt. Things escalated quickly. A week later, a police car rolled into the neighborhood and parked right in front of Margaret's house. Word spread fast. Homeowners gathered on their lawns, watching as officers knocked on her door. She didn't answer at first, but they weren't leaving. After several minutes, the door creaked open, and Margaret stepped out. She looked different, disheveled, exhausted. Gone was the pristine, immaculately dressed woman who had once lorded over the community. Now, she was just another person caught in a web of her own making. The officers spoke with her for a while, their voices too low to hear. Then, one of them pulled out a folder, flipping through pages before showing them to her. Margaret's face lost what little color it had left. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for, one of the officers gestured for her to turn around. The crowd held its breath as they placed handcuffs around her wrists. A collective murmur rippled through the neighborhood as Margaret was led to the police car. She didn't say a word, didn't look at anyone. She kept her head down, her jaw clenched tight. The door shut behind her, and just like that, she was gone. As the car pulled away, the neighborhood erupted into whispered conversations. Some people were shocked, others relieved. But one thing was clear: Margaret's reign was officially over. In the days that followed, the interim committee worked to undo the damage she had caused. Homeowners who had been unfairly fined were reimbursed. The ridiculous HOA rules Margaret had enforced purely out of spite were revoked. The financial records were handed over to a forensic accountant to ensure nothing else had been missed. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy my home without the constant threat of petty fines and power-hungry board members breathing down my neck. The HOA was no longer a tool for control, it was finally working for the community, not against it. And with Margaret out of the picture, the neighborhood could finally move forward. Justice had been served, and this time, it wasn't the homeowners who paid the price. With Margaret gone and the HOA under new leadership, the neighborhood finally had a chance to breathe. The oppressive fines, the arbitrary rules, the endless nitpicking, it all faded into memory. People started making changes to their homes without fear of retaliation. Yards that had once been kept sterile and uniform now had character, with flower beds blooming and porch swings appearing where there had once been nothing but strict compliance. But dismantling Margaret's mess wasn't just about fixing the neighborhood's aesthetics. The interim committee had to untangle years of financial mismanagement, and that meant dealing with what Margaret had left behind. Greg and Dana, now acting as the financial oversight team, spent their days poring over records. The deeper they dug, the more they found. There were projects billed to the HOA that had never been completed, some that had never even started. Payments had been made to contractors that didn't exist. It was as if Margaret had been running a personal slush fund right under everyone's noses, banking on the fact that no one would ever question her authority. One evening, Greg showed up at my doorstep with a thick folder under his arm. He looked more frustrated than I'd ever seen him. Without a word, he stepped inside and dropped the folder onto my kitchen counter, flipping it open. Inside were invoices, dozens of them. Some were for work that was supposed to have been done at the clubhouse, others for landscaping projects that never materialized. But what caught my attention was the company name stamped on all of them. It was Margaret's cousin's business. Greg explained that the payments had been funneled through this company for years. It looked legitimate on paper, but there was no evidence that any actual work had been done. Homeowners had been paying inflated HOA fees to fund what was essentially a family-run embezzlement scheme. As we went through the documents, Dana called to confirm what we already suspected. Margaret wasn't the only one involved. A few of the former board members had been in on it, approving payments and covering for her when questions arose. They thought they were untouchable. But they weren't. With the evidence in hand, the interim committee filed a civil lawsuit against the former board members involved. It wasn't just about recovering stolen money, it was about making sure no one else tried to pull something like this again. The news spread fast. The same people who had once feared speaking up now felt empowered. Homeowners who had stayed quiet under Margaret's rule started coming forward with their own stories, times they had been pressured into paying fees they didn't owe, times they had been threatened with liens when they pushed back. With mounting legal pressure, two of the former board members who had been involved in Margaret's schemes agreed to cooperate. They provided signed statements detailing how decisions had been made, how funds had been misappropriated, and how Margaret had bullied them into silence. It was the final nail in the coffin. The court ruled in favor of the homeowners, ordering full reimbursement for all fraudulent fines and misused funds. The HOA's accounts were replenished, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood didn't feel like a financial trap. With the legal battles settled, the interim committee transitioned into a permanent board, one elected by the homeowners, not self-appointed tyrants like Margaret. The new leadership focused on transparency, ensuring that every meeting was open to the community and every financial decision had proper oversight. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my home the way I had always intended. The bushes, I had planted the same ones that Margaret had used as an excuse to triple my fees, grew tall and healthy. a quiet reminder of the battle that had been fought and won. Greg remained active in the HOA, not because he sought power, but because he wanted to make sure no one ever abused it again. Dana took charge of financial reviews, ensuring that every dollar collected from homeowners went exactly where it was supposed to. And Margaret, she never returned to the neighborhood. Her house went up for sale a few months after her arrest, and no one seemed particularly sad to see it go. The new owners were a young couple excited to start fresh, unaware of the history their home carried. The neighborhood had changed. Not just in leadership, but in spirit. People had learned the power of standing up for themselves, of questioning authority when it overstepped its bounds. The fear that had once kept everyone in line was gone, replaced by a sense of community stronger than ever before. And as I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm hues, I couldn't help but smile. Margaret had tried to control everything. But in the end, control had slipped right through her fingers.